June 20th, 1944, Lieutenant Tom Bronn had been airborne for 4 hours. His fuel gauge was inching toward empty as his Avenger droned through darkness, only black Pacific below. Then the ocean exploded into light. Nearly every ship in Task Force 58 shattered blackout protocol at once. Searchlights blazed skyward. Deck lights, running lights, signal lamps, everything burning bright. Battleships fired star shells that burst overhead in cascading phosphorus. Enemy submarines still prowled these waters. A single torpedo could send 1,000 men to the bottom, and still they lit every light they had. Bronn spotted the nearby Lexington's deck, already swarmed with aircraft. The landing signal officer waved him off. Try another carrier. But his engine was already dying. If he couldn't find a place to land, in a few seconds, he'd be in the water. The battles between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the United States Navy in 1942 were a showdown of epic proportions that reframed naval warfare. At Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz, aircraft carriers proved they could decide battles from hundreds of miles away, sending battleships into obsolescence. Japan paid dearly for these lessons. Their elite pilots, who once dominated the skies, terrifying American rookies, vanished beneath Pacific waves or burned in their cockpits, victims of Allied code-breaking and aggressive tactics. Many of their carriers were also now rusting on the Pacific Ocean floor. In an attempt to turn the tide, the Empire spent exorbitant amounts of money rebuilding its shattered air groups, training new pilots, and assembling fresh squadrons. At the same time, naval planners waited for their chance to reverse the tide. In the late spring of 1944, that chance finally arrived. Fresh after tearing through the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, the American island-hopping forces were now aiming for Saipan in the Marianas, just 1,200 nautical miles from Tokyo. Once taken, its airfields would finally put the mighty B-29 bombers within striking distance of the Japanese homeland. With this, Admiral Soemu Toyota ordered Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa to set Operation Eigo in motion. Ozawa carried the nickname Gargoyle, supposedly because he was one of the ugliest admirals in the Imperial Japanese Navy. But behind his weathered and suntanned face worked a sharp tactical mind who was now commanding the first mobile fleet with nearly every operational warship at his disposal. His fleet bristled with firepower. 5 fleet carriers, including flagship Taiho, Junyo, and Hio, joined by Pearl Harbor veterans Shokaku and Suikaku. 4 light carriers added their squadrons to the mix. Screening this floating airfield were 5 battleships, 12 cruisers, and 22 destroyers. The numbers were undoubtedly impressive. Ozawa commanded 430 carrier aircraft, plus another 540 land-based fighters and bombers scattered across Pacific Islands. He knew his lightweight Zeros and torpedo bombers could strike from 100 miles beyond American range. The plan was for the land-based aircraft to tear through the U.S. fleet first, then his carriers would finish what remained. But though nearly 1,000 Japanese aircraft against the approaching Americans seemed overwhelming on paper, statistics concealed a fatal weakness. The veteran pilots who had terrorized Pearl Harbor and dominated the war's early months were gone. Their replacements came straight from abbreviated training programs, some with barely 100 hours in the cockpit. Ozawa understood these limitations, but pressed forward anyway, as he knew the Americans grew stronger. Operation Eigo would either save the Empire or confirm what the lost battles of 1942 had already suggested, that Japan's moment of supremacy had passed forever. Admiral Raymond Spruance had built his career on cold logic and ice-water calm. Where other admirals charged ahead on instinct, the 57-year-old calculated every move like a chess master planning 10 moves ahead. He knew the Marianas invasion would force Japan's carriers into the open, though any other admiral worth his stars would chase these carriers to the ends of the earth, especially aggressive commanders like Bull Halsey, who lived for the carrier hunt. He decided to play an entirely different game. He'd keep his carriers close enough to shield Saipan's marines and supply ships. If Ozawa wanted a fight, he'd have to come get it. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed Normandy, on the other side of the world, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher guided Task Force 58 out of the Marshall Islands' Majuro Harbor, an invasion force so large that 5 hours elapsed before the final ship cleared the harbor and set course for the Marianas. Mitcher's task force stretched across 700 square miles of the Pacific Ocean, a floating armada of nearly 100 warships. At its core were 15 aircraft carriers, carrying more than 900 aircraft, including the powerful new F-6F Hellcat. Flanking the carriers were heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and dozens of destroyers, forming layered screens of anti-aircraft fire and radar coverage. 7 battleships brought up the rear, ready to unleash their guns if the enemy closed. It was the most powerful carrier force ever assembled, disciplined and built to shatter the Imperial Navy. As they headed into their latest mission, the Americans radiated confidence. When Life magazine correspondent Noel Bush interviewed Admiral Mitcher, the commander said he expected to fight his way to Saipan and seemed pleased at the prospect. While Japan struggled to replace its lost veterans with half-trained rookies, the U.S. Navy rotated experienced pilots home to train new recruits, then sent them back to the fleet. This system kept feeding skilled aviators into squadrons. Like their admiral, the pilots shared this eagerness, telling Bush they hoped the Japanese would show up rather than hide. The pilots wanted a fight, and they were about to get one. But before the Marines hit Saipan's beaches, Spruance knew that in order to win, he must also own the skies. On June 11th, American carriers turned loose their squadrons on every Japanese airfield within range. All through the day, Hellcats swept low over Guam, Rota, Saipan, and Tinian, their 650 caliber guns walking the lines of fire across neat rows of parked aircraft. Behind the fighters came the powerful dive bombers, planting 500-pounders into hangars, fuel dumps, and control towers. Though Zeros scrambled to intercept, these Rust trainees were no match for the American veterans, who twisted inside their turns, hammered them with deflection shots, and sent them spinning into the jungle below in one-sided dogfights. By June 12th, the island's air power was obliterated from existence, and the land-based squadrons Ozawa counted on to salvage the American fleet were gone. But 500 miles away, Ozawa studied his charts aboard the flagship Taiho, reviewing how the shore-based aircraft would coordinate with his carriers. Vice Admiral Kakada, commanding the devastated land forces, never sent word of the disaster. On the 15th, as Marines stormed Saipan's beaches, Ozawa finally received the message he'd been waiting for: attack the Americans in the Mariana Islands and destroy their carrier force. American submarines, lurking off Japan, spotted the fleet right as it left port. Their coded reports reached Spruance within hours, confirming what he'd expected. From there, he gave the supply ships 2 more days to finish unloading at Saipan, then ordered them east as fast as they could to get them away from the coming storm. In turn, his carriers would hold position, staying close enough to cover the invasion beaches. Spruance's plan was simple. Ozawa would come to him. Let the Japanese stretch their fuel and nerves, crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean. Only if they got close enough, he'd strike. But those Marines on Saipan came first, no matter what. Now, the coming battle depended on who found whom first. For more than a day, both admirals circled each other in the vast ocean, waiting for that first crucial sighting. The day of June 18th, 1944, nearly slipped away without contact, but shortly before dusk, Japanese search planes finally spotted the American fleet. But with darkness falling, and still unsure whether nearby airfields could support his planes, Ozawa decided to wait for morning. Only a few moments later, American search planes also found the Japanese, following an intercepted radio transmission that pinpointed Ozawa's position, 355 miles west-southwest, closing steadily. Thrilled, Task Force Commander Mark Mitcher saw an opportunity. If he reversed course now and steamed west at full speed through the night, they could launch a dawn strike and catch the Japanese with their planes still on deck. Spruance's reply was shocking. Permission denied. Task Force 58 would continue east as ordered, holding position near Saipan. He'd already run the numbers and believed Ozawa's pilots would strike in the morning, when his own squadrons were rested and his defenses were fully prepared. Through the night, American ships shifted into a layered trap, with Admiral Willis Lee's battleships forming the outer wall with their anti-aircraft guns. Behind them, Spruance's carrier group spread north to south in a defensive line. Any Japanese pilot lucky enough to survive the fearless American fighters would face Lee's battleships, then the carrier's own guns. Meanwhile, Ozawa's pilots would launch at first light, coordinate with the land-based squadrons, and catch the Americans between two forces, still counting on 500 planes that no longer existed. Dawn would bring a devastating revelation. At 8:30 a.m. on June 19th, Ozawa launched his first strike when 69 aircraft lifted off his carriers and turned east toward the American fleet. In turn, the American radar operators spotted the incoming raid when they were still 150 miles out. By 10:23 a.m., hundreds of American fighters were airborne, climbing hard to intercept altitude. What followed was brutal. More than half the Japanese planes fell before they even glimpsed an American ship. Only a handful of Imperial pilots broke through. One dove at Lexington, only to be caught in crossfire from two cruisers, whose combined anti-aircraft fire literally tore the plane apart mid-dive. Another managed to hit the battleship South Dakota, but not a single attacker reached the carriers. In just 34 minutes, the first wave was over. Of 69 Japanese aircraft, only 27 limped home. Elated pilots landed back on their carriers, whooping and comparing victory counts. Lieutenant Commander Paul Buey heard one pilot shout to another, quote, "It was just like an old-time turkey shoot down home." This phrase spread from ship to ship. Within hours, everyone was calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. As Ozawa's second wave of 128 aircraft roared off the flight decks, pilot Sakio Komatsu caught sight of something through the morning haze that made his blood freeze. A torpedo wake cutting through the water, arrow straight toward Taiho's hull. In seconds, Komatsu made his choice. Banking hard, he pushed his stick forward and dove. His aircraft slammed into the torpedo in a thunderous explosion of fuel and metal. Aboard Taiho, sailors cheered their savior. But deep beneath the waves, the American submarine Albacore's periscope was already tracking the carrier again. Komatsu had bought his ship mere hours before. Nothing more. The second wave fared no better. 19 planes fell before contact. Within 30 minutes, 70 more were shot down. During the third and fourth waves, most pilots got lost or fled to Guam's airfields, where they were surprised to find American fighters already waiting for them. By noon, it was over. Of Ozawa's 374 aircraft, barely 100 returned. The rest littered the Pacific or burned on Guam's runways. Against this carnage, Spruance had lost just 22 planes and 60 men. Ozawa's humiliating day wasn't finished. While his surviving plane struggled home, American submarines circled beneath like sharks. Pilot Komatsu had sacrificed himself, stopping Albacore's first torpedo. But the submarine had remained in position, and soon her second torpedo found its mark. The weapon punched through Taiho's starboard hull, and immediately, aviation fuel began flooding the damaged compartments. Damage control teams worked desperately, pumping the volatile fuel overboard before it could ignite. At 3:32 p.m., a spark found the fumes. The explosion tore Taiho apart from the inside. Fuel blasted through both hangar walls. The flight deck buckled upward like paper. Massive holes opened in her hull as the proud carrier began her death roll. Ozawa barely escaped to a destroyer, watching from its deck as 1,500 of his men vanished with the flagship. But the submarines weren't done hunting. Commander Kostler in Kavala had been tracking the carrier Shokaku since morning. He fired 6 torpedoes. 4 slammed home, ripping into the Pearl Harbor veteran's hull. Another 1,200 sailors joined their comrades in the depths. In one morning, Spruance had shattered Japanese naval aviation, and his pilots were still eager to finish what they'd started. But Spruance held firm until 10 o'clock on the night of June 19th, when he finally turned west to hunt the fleeing Japanese. Search planes found nothing all day, until much later, at 4 p.m. the following day, when Enterprise aircraft spotted Ozawa's fleet 275 miles away, the absolute limit of American strike range. Mitcher faced an impossible choice. Launch now, and his pilots would attack at dusk, then fly back in total darkness with empty fuel tanks. The advisors and staff beside him warned he'd lose dozens of aircraft and crews. Nonetheless, Mitcher gave the order he'd been waiting so long for. Launch everything. Within 20 minutes, over 200 aircraft roared off the carriers, all well aware they'd need every drop of fuel just to reach the target. Then it got worse. An updated position came through. Ozawa was 60 miles farther than first reported. Just as the fuel neared empty and hope drained away, the pilots spotted wakes cutting across the darkening ocean. The Americans attacked in waves, 216 aircraft screaming down through the fading light. Ozawa watched helplessly as his last 75 fighters were torn apart in minutes. Every Japanese ship erupted in defensive fire, streams of tracers crisscrossing the darkening sky, but the attackers kept coming. Light carrier Hio caught it the worst. Bombs smashed through her deck plating and detonated deep in her vitals. In minutes, she capsized, dragging 250 men into the abyss. Fleet carrier Zuikaku, the Pearl Harbor veteran, bucked and heaved as explosions walked across her length. Fleet carrier Junyo became an inferno, flames shooting from her hangar bays. Even light carrier Chiyoda took savage hits, her gunners still firing as she blazed. 20 American planes spiraled down through the flak, but they'd already delivered the killing blow. As the last attacker vanished eastward, Ozawa surveyed his devastation. From 430 planes at dawn, barely 24 still flew. Now the American pilots faced their own ordeal, finding their carriers in pitch darkness with empty fuel tanks. 2 hours of night flight stretched ahead. Engine drones filled exhausted ears, while instruments blurred in dark cockpits. Then the ditching began. A Hellcat's engine coughed and seized, the fighter gliding down to crash into the blank Pacific. Minutes later, another plane ran dry. Soon dozens were going down. Luckily for the pilots, Mitcher, always thinking of his aviators, prepared a welcome he knew they would appreciate. He spread his task groups 15 miles apart for maximum coverage. Then Mitcher made the decision that would define his legacy. Every naval manual, every piece of training said the same thing. In hostile waters at night, you stay dark. Lights meant submarines could line up torpedo shots from miles away. Lights meant every ship became a target. And yet his order went out across the radio nets. Turn on all lights. Everything. Soon, all across the dark Pacific, the impossible happened. Every ship in Task Force 58 lit up at once. Searchlights blazed skyward. 5-inch guns fired star shells that burst overhead in showers of white phosphorus. Running lights, deck lights, even cabin portholes glowed. The fleet transformed into a blazing beacon visible for miles, announcing its position to every submarine in the area. For 2 chaotic hours, Mitcher's bold decision paid off. Aircraft found the illuminated fleet and came streaming home. Pilots landed on any deck they could reach, nearly half on the wrong ship, but alive. Some crashed on landing, exhausted crews misjudging the approach after hours of combat. Others ran out of fuel before reaching a deck, but even they had hope. Destroyers and cruisers raced to each splash, searchlights sweeping the water, pulling men from the ocean. The lights made all the difference. Without them, hundreds would have vanished into the black Pacific. Instead, rescue crews hauled 143 airmen from the water. When dawn broke, the miracle was clear. Of over 200 pilots who had attacked at dusk, expecting never to return, most were safely aboard American ships. Though 80 aircraft were lost and 50 brave men didn't make it home, Mitcher's defiant blaze of light had saved the rest. That same night, he once again requested to pursue Ozawa through the night, but Spruance said no. Over the following 3 days, the leader wrapped up operations. He dispatched Admiral Lee's battleships and cruisers westward on June 21st, hoping to intercept the fleeing Japanese fleet, but Ozawa had vanished into the vastness of the Pacific. By June 23rd, with Saipan's invasion secure from naval interference, Spruance ordered the bulk of Task Force 58 back to Eniwetok for much-needed maintenance and refueling, and the Battle of the Philippine Sea, also known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, was officially over. In the months that followed, controversy erupted over Spruance's cautious tactics. In his battle report, Mitchell wrote that the enemy had escaped, that while badly hurt by one aggressive carrier strike when within range, the Japanese fleet simply had not been sunk. Most naval aviators agreed. Spruance had let Ozawa slip away. But correspondent Bush, who had watched Spruance's cold calculations unfold firsthand through the battle, saw it differently. In his assessment, what Spruance had achieved in the Philippine Sea was one of the most complete victories of the entire Pacific War, stating, quote, "Chances are that the Japanese fleet will never emerge again as a fighting force in this war. Its absence from the South Pacific will give General MacArthur a clear field there.